Two, three, one, go for it.
Hi, this is Deepa again, and with Ravi and Dr. Paul Wagner. We are former students of Dr. Wagner from University of Houston Clear Lake, and we're trying to um, get him to talk to us about the ethics and leadership. Dr. Wagner, for today's topic, it's on moral theory. What do you think about, or do you have any thoughts on ethics and morality?
Yeah, ethics and morality are related, but they're not the same. Once upon a time, just 60 years ago, if you looked at any college catalog, a course that was morals 2422 or something, or ethics 2422 would have been the same course. We didn't make a distinction between them. Beginning in the 1970s, with sociologists and then lawyers, they started saying, well, ethics should be courses in the rules that prescribe how to behave, perhaps for an organization, and morality was something different. Now, what different that wasn't clear. And sometimes people thought, well, it's your own moral outlook on the world. Well, that kind of obscures what both morality is about and what ethics is about. Now, it's true that both morals and ethics are rules that prescribe or prohibit things. But we try to get those rules correct. We don't just willy-nilly throw anything out there. We certainly have seen in history where some obnoxious rules, some horrible rules, have been enforced in different situations and led to a great deal of human destruction. It's best to start with, actually, we probably can best start with Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher from about 1600 years ago. He raised the central question of what morality is all about. And he did it by telling a parable. And the parable goes something like this. In ancient China, they were very specific about the rules one ought to follow, and the customs and rules of etiquette were not distinguished from moral rules. And so a young student asks the master, Master, what if one day you're walking with your sister and you're crossing a very turbulent stream, and she's all bound up in this ritualistic garb that women were expected to wear in those days, and she falls into the stream. Now, if you do nothing at all, she'll be washed away and she'll die. If you reach out to grab her, you'll be touching her in public. And that was very much of a no-no in ancient China. It disgraced a woman to be touched by a man in public. And so he says to the master, there we have a conflict of morals. And Lao Tzu has the master saying back to him, you do not understand the point of morality. And that's where the parable ends. And I think it's a very profound place to end because the student did not understand what morality was about. He was confused and thinking it was about a set of rules. Now, morality does have to end with prescriptions and prohibitions that prescribe to do certain things and to avoid doing certain other things. But all of that rests upon a foundation that's much deeper, as Lao Tzu would say, the point of morality. And it doesn't make any difference where you are in history. It doesn't make any difference where you are geographically in this world. It doesn't make any difference what religions you have, or if you're an atheist, or whatever might be going on in your life. None of that affects what the central question is of the point of morality. And it's a single question. And that single question is, how ought I to treat another? Regardless of your religion or your atheism or anything else, you still have to figure out, how ought I to treat another? Now, certainly in some religions, they're going to also have additional baggage advising people on how they ought to think about and interact with their God or gods or whatever. But the central question of morality doesn't change regardless of what your religion or absence of religion is, or what your role is in a commercial society or a professional society. It's always that central question. How ought I to treat another? Well, it also raises a second issue that we sometimes avoid in contemporary times, and that is the distinction between the concepts of truth and knowledge. And we particularly become confused about those two concepts when we are talking about morality. So let me first of all talk about knowing and the distinction between that and truth, and then take it back to our talking about morality. Knowing is something that happens inside a brain. And in English, we use the verb form of knowing, and we use other uh, verb forms for a lot of things that happen inside human minds. So we talk about doubting, we talk about opinionating, we talk about reflecting, we talk about considering, and in all of those, in addition to a verb form, there's also a noun form. So we have a consideration, we have an opinion, we have a belief, we have a doubt, we have knowledge. But when we get to the word truth, everything changes. Truth is a noun, and there is no verb form. There is no truthing. The reason this is important is because all those verbs, verbs are action words, right? And they represent action, in this case, that happens inside the mind. Knowledge is what we strive for in the moral world as well as in all the rest of the world. But knowledge is a reach for something. It's a reach for something outside the individual mind. It's also something we reach for outside of our tribe, our cities, our states, and our nations. Truth is whatever representation maps onto the world as the world truly is at the moment. So it doesn't depend at all on what's going on in our minds, and thank goodness for that, because the human mind is a very turbulent sort of thing. What we eat and what emotional things come our way are very disruptive of what goes on in our mind. In fact, to be a clear thinker at times, we have to really focus and work hard to keep our mind um, in laser-like fashion on solving a particular problem we want to solve. But whether we do a good job of trying to acquire knowledge or not, the truth, whatever that is, sits out there and rests alone. We talk a lot in education about pragmatism, which is a very important area of uh, philosophy and of moral thinking. And one of the things that's interesting about the pragmatists, the original pragmatists, John Dewey, who everyone in education has heard of, John Dewey and William James and C.S. Peirce, as well as their descendants at Harvard today, such as W.B. Quine, Hilary Putnam, and Israel Scheffler, they were all concerned first and foremost with the concept of truth. And like many other philosophers and psychologists and scientists of all kinds, they recognized that it may be impossible to ever guarantee to oneself or to others that you have grasped the truth written all out in capital letters. But nonetheless, the pragmatists agreed it's still the truth that we ought to be reaching for. We shouldn't be willing to settle for just any idea that comes to mind, either in physics or biology or in morals. We want to come up with those bits of belief that we think should be privileged as knowledge. And a belief is privileged as knowledge to the extent it seems to approximate truth. Now, we'll never know if we've captured that guarantee that we got the truth. But we know when we're making progress when we find ourselves moving away from error. For example, in human history, we found that all around the world, slavery was going on. Uh, People either enslaved others or were enslaved by others. Here in the Western Hemisphere, We had slavery going on in the United States up till 1862. And in South America, you had the major nation, Brazil, had slavery going on until 1888 before they got rid of it. Now, I'm quite comfortable that we have achieved a credible bit of knowledge when we conclude that slavery is wrong. It's wrong. And I don't think there are too many people that would argue with that. Now, can we guarantee that we have this absolute truth with regards to slavery? Well, we can't guarantee that we have absolute truth in anything, but I'm very comfortable that our approximation with regards to the wrongness of slavery is apt. And I certainly wouldn't want to do away with my commitment to the idea, to the knowledge that I have, that slavery is wrong and should be avoided. We have other things going on in our country right now about how we ought to treat one another. And in every one of those situations, think of the question I just used, how we ought to treat one another. And it matters. We can't just treat one another any way we feel. We can't just treat one another in any way that we and a couple of our friends say we want to treat others. We've got to do better than that. We've got to think carefully about how we ought to treat one another. And so students in school from kindergarten all the way to graduate school have to always be reminded of Lao Tzu's central question: how ought I to treat another? If you're going to understand the point of morality, you have to take seriously the question, how ought I to treat another? Not just any answer will do. For an answer to be worthy, it's got to be the most error-free approximation of truth that we can access. Now, there are all sorts of other ways of thinking about matters of morality. Very famous people, Aristotle and Plato and Kant and John Sturton, all these people have talked about different aspects of moral theory, trying to get an answer to the question of how do you know what's right. But the getting that answer is very difficult, but we don't give up on the quest. We keep working at it, and just as in the case of slavery, we do move further away from error. We do make advances. We just can't guarantee we've got it just right. You know, it's interesting. An analogy is in physics, Isaac Newton came up with calculus. And the whole point of calculus was they had a phrase called straightening the curve. When they were looking at curves, they couldn't quite measure them. And they thought, well, if you keep on making smaller and smaller, like going from a circle to a stop sign configuration or a more multiple configuration of little square or little straight lines, that somehow you would get to the actual perimeter value of whatever the geometric figure, parent circle that you were looking at, but we could never flatten a curve. Well, with calculus, what we came up with was a really nifty tool that comes very close to flattening the curve. Does it give us absolute and precise descriptions of how curved activity goes on, either in our immediate world or out in space? Not exactly, particularly inside the atom and not when we're looking across galaxies, but it does a pretty darn good job. And we count it as a bit of knowledge that we want to grasp in physics. The parallel holds up in the moral world too. I'm just as confident that there ought not to be slavery. I'm just as confident that we ought to treat one another with respect. I'm just as confident that as a species, we're far more likely to survive and flourish to the extent that we cooperate with each other rather than defect for personal and self-interest. I'm ready to take a breath now, Paul.
So, I do have a question for you regarding the philosopher that you mentioned, Aristotle, um, based on his virtue theory, which virtues do you think are most necessary in educational leadership today?
It's a good question because Aristotle was started off with that standard question as to all moral theorists, how ought I to treat others? He couldn't figure out any rules that he was certain ought to be embraced. But it did seem to him that there were certain virtues that made somebody better or made somebody a more apt leader. A job that Aristotle got himself when he was getting a little bit older was to be a school teacher, a tutor to a certain fellow by the name of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, of course, had conquered all at the time was known world in that part of the globe. And he tutored Alexander on how he ought to lead. And so Alexander the Great, who was known as being a very accomplished leader, and after he conquered certain areas, he put governors and so on into place that continued to develop the well-being of the people there. He went from Macedonia down to the Greek states, conquered all the Greek states, goes to Egypt. And then from Egypt, after he conquers Egypt, he heads towards the further east. But in Egypt, under governors that he left behind, the great library of Alexandria was built. And other things were built in Egypt that made it a very robust country for centuries afterwards, thanks to the early leadership of Alexander, and that he learned from Aristotle, focusing attention on the virtues. And I think we can even mention a few virtues that surely any leader will benefit from. Number one, integrity. Are you the person you say you are? Honesty. Can people count on your word? Three, courageous. Can you have what it takes to stand up in tough times to serve those who you intend to lead? Um, Loyalty. Every leader wants loyalty from their subordinates, but subordinates want loyalty from their leader. So are you a loyal person? Are you a person of discernment? Or do you just rely on black and white rules? Do you have, and kind of relate courage to this too, do you have the courage to take your time and discern whether or not a certain breach of common practices is merited by the extraordinary situation we find in a particular context we're facing right now? A set of black and white rules won't carry us through every situation. But Aristotle thought, well, a set of virtues can take us further into answering that question, how ought I to treat another person? You're on mute, Paul.
I'm sorry. So I said, as these conversations that we're having are unscripted, my mind runs around like 100 miles an hour whenever you're saying things. And then I'm trying to remember, like, okay, when I can ask a question, I want to make sure I ask this, I ask this. It's just so much information. But I do have a question that just popped up. Um, I remember in our class, you mentioned that you were in the military at early age. So I know the adolescent's behavior. It seems to be driven by self-interest or fear. In your opinion, or in your experience, in the military and outside the military, is it self-interest or fear?
Well, human beings have an instinctual capacity for both self-interest and for cooperation. You find that in all of our primate cousins too. Look at bonobos, look at chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on. They may every now and then grab a banana from another primate, and so they're acting out of self-interest. but they also collect together to fend off intrusions by another chimpanzee tribe or by another species. In the case of, say, gorillas and humans are coming into their jungle, they'll collect together, or the grayback and maybe a couple other males will stand behind while the rest of the gorilla pack runs for cover somewhere. So we, like our primate cousins, we have an instinct for both self-interest and cooperation. We do better when we develop in ourselves and in our children the instinct to cooperate. That's much more likely to sustain the viability of the species than if we allow self-interest to go rampant. Now, in the military, they do a great deal of focus training on cooperation because of the platoon leader says charge, and half the platoon are going, well, I don't know if I want to charge. And you've got half of the platoon out there, it'll just get slaughtered. You need everybody pulling with one another to accomplish the task that's been assigned the platoon. Now, out in civilian life, is cooperation just as important? It's just as important, but it seems like we can extend a little bit more latitude to self-interest as opposed to cooperation. And so we don't get particularly annoyed in our neighborhood if there's one neighbor who doesn't get out there and keep his grass cut as short as everybody else and as promptly as everybody else. If he lets it go wild, then we're going to complain. We're going to say you need to cooperate with us better. But if he's just kind of late each week in getting that done, we'll be more likely to accommodate that individuality than we can afford to accommodate similar individuality when we're in a very intense situation like military operations are often demanding. Similarly, in civilian life, in an operating room, there isn't a lot of room for individuality. The surgeon is in charge. The anesthesiologist is the kind of like the next person to work at the surgeon's side, and everybody else has to be a team player with no personal objectives outside of what the team is instructed to do to carry out an effective surgery on the particular patient on the table.
It's very interesting. So I know, I think from the last conversation, um, I'm not sure if we already touched on this, but the sixth sense about the moral, right?
Right.
Could you go over that a little, please?
Well, neuroscientists have done an amazing job taking us beyond the psychology of the last century. And so one of the things that we know is that we have more than five senses. Back when I was in school, they told us we had five senses. We have other senses, for example, the sense of balance. And that's a physiologically responsive sense. It depends upon the hairs that are growing on the inside of our ears. It depends on whether or not the middle ear is on each side of the head is equally open. All sorts of things affect that sense of balance. And we think there's other senses as well. And one of those senses, yeah, can very well be our instincts to cooperate or to defect. So we'll learn more. We don't, as in everything else, we don't have all the answers yet. I'm not sure we have any grand answers, but we're making advance. We're moving forward, and uh, we know that our instinct for cooperation benefits the species survival far more than our instinct for self-interest. While in contrast, our instinct for self-interest may benefit any one of us at the moment, but there's always a price to be paid, a cost to the well-being of the community when one person, and perhaps another, and another begins to defect. acting on the basis of self-interest and casting aside a commitment to cooperation. How many self-interested people does it take to finally fragment a society? I don't know. I think a historian can probably tell us some of that. We may get to see some of that in our own lifetimes. But when groups fail to cooperate, as the mathematical biologist Martin Nowak has said, and he's at Harvard, and Carl Sigman at the University of Vienna, both of them have pointed out a number of mathematical models that show when you have a certain number of defectors in communities of different sorts of species, that species will, that species grouping will fragment, and that community will be destroyed. And if that were to become large scale in any way, that could account for the extinction of a species. In schools, one of the things that happens to keep us back to education, everybody remembers, starting, I think, in junior high and going into high school, the forming of cliques, so the popular kids. And most people want to be a part of the popular crowd. But that's kind of destructive to everybody else. If you're not part of the popular crowd, you feel like an outsider, which you are. But look inside the clique. Inside the clique, inevitably, there's going to be somebody or other people that try to maneuver some other folks that are part of the clique out of the clique, thinking that if they can make the clique smaller, then those of them who are still in it are clearly the most important and popular kids in school. But when people start trying to oust another member of the clique, they're defecting. And their defection, if it is copied by some others who work with them, will inevitably lead to further defections, and the clique finally breaks apart. Perhaps by the time you're a senior in high school, what had been a clique is now perhaps a half a dozen different groups, and even they're not bound together very well. On a large scale, you look at France back during the French Revolution. The Parisian mob thought that all the people who were wealthier and in a better situation than they were the enemy. And a guy by the name of Robespierre led this mass revolution. And it was at the time when Marie Antoinette had her head chopped off, and a lot of noblemen were killed, a lot of scholars were killed, clergy were killed by the Parisian masses. They used that guillotine to lop off the heads of many people. And lo and behold, what happened as everyone was acting out of self-interest, trying to get more and more out of the former structure that had been their community. Well, they started turning on each other. And in the end, Robespierre himself was guillotined. It becomes very dangerous when you encourage action on the basis solely of self-interest. You discard cooperation meant for the benefit of all. In times like that, people start forgetting that important question of morality. What ought I to do for others?
Very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Wagner. So that would conclude our topic, moral theory, for today.
All right. See you next time.
Here, Ravi.